I'm Lee Griffith, a former communications director who now coaches leaders to shrug off the stereotypes and find their own way of leading with impact. On the Leaders with Impact podcast, I talk with real leaders about what shaped their approach. I chat with experts who will challenge your thinking, and I share my own strategies for success. If you enjoy this podcast and want to shake things up with your leadership development, then why not recommend me to work with your organisation? Visit sundayskies.com or drop an email to lwi@sundayskies.com. In today's episode, I'm talking with Tomi Ayodeji, an expert in supporting organisations to manage a multi-generational workforce. We talk about how, with a widening age range of staff in the workplace, organisations are needing to look again at things like recruitment and retention, diversity and inclusion, communications practices. In fact, there isn't an area of the workplace that isn't impacted by this issue. I hope you enjoy. I'm delighted to welcome Tomi Ayodeji to the Leaders with Impact podcast. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me, Lee.
We are going to be talking about multi-generational workforces. This is something that you help organisations with. And I suppose the best starting point for our conversation is probably to explain what we mean when we're talking about multi-generational, because I'm sure some people will go, well, isn't that just everyone that works at an organisation?
Yeah. That's true. And it's interesting that you said so, because I was talking to a friend this week and I just said, oh, there are 5 generations in the workforce. And I was like, well, what do you mean there are 5 generations in the workforce? And I thought, maybe not everyone is aware.
Yeah.
So I'll probably start with that, with the fact that in today's workforce, particularly, I think, public sector organizations might have at least a minimum of 5 generations in the workforce. So we're talking from employees in their 80s to 27, 25-ish, right? And if a graduate comes in on an apprenticeship, even younger, right? So you've got all that in one organization, and you want people to communicate in the same way, learn the same way, work the same way as you've always worked, And I think the advent of technology is accelerating the rate of change within the workplace. And so, yes, generations have always been, in an organization. You've always had multi-generation. But I guess the unique thing is the advent of technology and the values and motivations of the younger cohort, right? What technology does to their way of working, what they think work is, what the future of work is, and the difference in values there is one. The second part of that is that we do have an aging workforce, and you have people staying longer in the workforce for various reasons, or re-entering, 50 plus re-entering as well. So, and people coming back with cost of living crisis, coming back into the workplace, even if it's an interim role. So you have all of us here, the younger generation, who do not stay in the workplace for more than 2-3 years, and then they turn around and move elsewhere. And then you have an older workforce who are feeling like they're being passed over for promotion. I hear that now you're considered old as a woman, 40 plus in the workplace. So what does that mean for everyone working there? These are some of the challenges that exist. And next year, 2025, the World Economic Forum predicts that 30% of the global workforce will be predominantly Gen Z. So those are those born 1997 to 2012. So we're talking, the oldest will be 27, youngest, what are we now, 2024 to 12, right?
Yeah.
So the workforce will be about 27% global workforce is Gen Z. 50 plus will be about 33%, right? And in the same workplace. What does that mean? Particularly as the younger generations aren't sticking, what impact does that have? We have a high rate of attrition with that young workforce, and we're losing knowledge when you don't keep the older workforce in. The younger ones aren't staying to learn as well from the older ones. So there is a whole different dynamic of things happening in one melting point. And most of us do come from families that are multi-generational, and we know some of the hiccups that happen when there are huge family get-togethers, and how that can be. But the difference is work isn't family. And we have to find a way to make it work.
Wow. Right. Okay. So there's a lot here that we're going to be going deeper in, I'm sure. Just so that I'm clear, from when we talk about generations, are we just meaning it in the way that you've just described, like Gen Z, for example? It's like the description or the explanation that they use nationally around the boomer generation, or is it, or do we look at it from a decade point of view? Because it seems, I always find it weird that the randomness of the years that you
it is random, right? It is quite random. But when I look at it for ease of understanding the era the individual was born in, right? So you have your baby boomers, 1946 to 62, and you think, what was happening then? How did that shape their ethics? How did that shape their concept of work? How did that shape their values? How did that shape their view of the environment around them, etc.? So you've got baby boomers, like you just said. We have Generation X, millennials, Generation Z, and then we have Alpha coming up soon after that. So some workplaces might have 6 generations for all we know. So I refer to it, I use those terms because there is some research around that. So that's easier for me to use. But I also I think one piece that is often overlooked, and I find that I like to look at it at generations, not just in terms of age, but also in terms of longevity in the workplace. So, you could have someone that is much younger, but they've been in that organization for 10 years. And they have knowledge that someone who's much older, but only has been there for a couple of years, has. And how do we transfer knowledge across without hindering people based on how long they've been there, how old they are, where we perceive them to have been in their career stage or season of life, when we think they are deemed ready for a promotion, etc. All this sort of thing.
So
does that answer your question?
It does, yeah. And I was also interested in, you said that it seems to be something particularly the public sector are experiencing in terms of having that whole breadth of generations. Why do you think that is, as opposed to other sectors?
I think generally people just tend to stay longer in the public sector. As someone that's worked in the public sector as well, the pension's very good.
Yes, true.
That is one clue. And I know from that experience that I know people who may have wanted to leave the workplace but haven't left because they really like the pension. It may not be the case now for a younger generation, but for an older generation, certainly the pension is a factor in why people stay. There is a perception that maybe the public sector is not quite as vicious as the private sector. So people tend to stay and they can get the work done. There's also that what brings people to the public sector, I like to think, is that they want to be a part of change, actually, and not really thinking about capitalism in that sense, but just want to be a part of something that is bigger than them. And that's what draws people to the public sector. And people do tend to stay long in those spaces because they really feel that they are a contributor to change in that regard. So those are some of the factors that cause that. They're also good programs for graduates to come into them. They're also the largest employer, in the UK as well. So it's the breadth of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how seriously do perhaps other organisations who aren't in public sector, perhaps don't have the same ethos or values or approach, how seriously should they be taking the whole construct of developing and building a multi-generational workforce?
That's an interesting question. And I think it really depends on what the data they're tracking tells them. So if an organization is tracking age, for instance, of their employees and looking at attrition and trying to find out if there's a correlation there, I would say that's where they would start to see if there is an issue. How long are your young workers staying for?
Yeah.
If they're leaving every 18 months and you're having this constant turnaround, open door, and then your managers have the challenge of not being motivated to mentor every new cohort that comes through because they're only going to be there, 18 months and then they're starting again. So they just, they're not as invested as well. So it's really engaging with your middle managers who I think are bearing the brunt of it to find out. And that's the sort of work that I like to do is working with those middle managers who are bearing the brunt of it, but also engaging with them and trying to find out from them what are their pain points when working with the new generation of workers. Bearing in mind that a lot of them graduated after or during the pandemic. Soft skills are a huge issue. They're a huge pain point because you've been working from home. That was your introduction to your first job, right? So those soft skills that come from learning how to manage conflict with others in the team, the kind of mentoring that happens by the water cooler conversations, just sitting next to someone, all those sorts of things are missing. So they're very skilled technologically, and I'm being stereotypical here.
Yeah.
But so you've got these great skills using the computer, software, AI, and all that, working online. But then interpersonal relationships are a bit lacking. And that may be where it shows up in all organizations, not just the private sector. I think the rate of attrition is one to watch out for if employees are leaving. I might be curious about why.
Yeah.
I might be curious about why. Now, it might not be quite a huge issue right now for some organizations, although some are experiencing it. But within the next 5 to 10 years, as that younger cohort start to become the larger group within the workplace, some of them are already in some form of team leadership already. It'll be interesting to see how organizations shape.
I'm assuming, though, the flip side can also be true if people, look at the makeup of their workforce and they find people are staying too long and are too set in their ways and perhaps aren't embracing change that need to happen. And so there's a balance. I'm assuming that organisations will need to get both in terms of the shape of the workforce and the look of the workforce and the age and all of the different dynamics, because they'll have a place that they're trying to get to as an organisation and they need the right people around for that.
Yeah. And I think that's a very interesting point, the fact that, change, right? That's constant. You always have new graduates coming into the workplace, right? That's constant. I think some of the differences we're seeing with young, and we saw it first with millennials, right? Coming into the workplace, pushing and trying to change the value system within organizations. And for instance, I remember being in a networking meeting once with a senior partner in a law firm. Now, for her struggle was when she started her career in the late 80s, she was on the phone 24/7, available to her employers. Well, maybe not 24/7, that's an exaggeration, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
After hours, right? After 9 to 5.
Always available.
She was available. When she went on holiday, she was available, right? And she cannot understand the junior lawyers coming into her practice, going on holiday and not being available.
Having boundaries.
Having boundaries. And part of me, and I'm thinking, okay, we're of the same generation, but I think, people are allowed to have a holiday.
Yeah, yeah.
There was that part of me that got that bit of the boundaries, but there was a part of me that got that bit that, yes, when we started work, or when I started work, you just did what had to be done, and you didn't ask any questions. You didn't challenge the system. We have a younger generation challenging the system, right? And part of that challenge is what is causing the attrition, in the sense that if in 2-3 years, I'm not going to wait 10 years for you to give me what I think I deserve, right? Now, hence why we call that some of them the entitled generation, right? But it's the idea that life is too short. I don't want to wait 10 years before you recognize me. Now, an organization can respond and say, no, you wait as long as I waited, right? Leaders could respond that way. We say, okay, how can we engage them now so they do feel a part of what's happening here? We can retain them. They want to be a contribute. They want to contribute to what's happening. They want to be part of the change, and they want to attribute their position to that change, right? Not their line manager, not someone that's, So how can we change the world of work to involve them in more stuff at the get-go, rather than saying, wait your turn, right? So there are different things like that that are worth exploring.
So what's going through my mind as you're talking is so I'm looking at it through the lens of a younger workforce and the wants and needs and desires that they have.
Yeah.
Which could be the polar opposite of the workforce, or the desires of an older people who work in my organisation.
Yeah.
And who's to say which is right? Because I'm assuming the challenge from a leadership perspective is, how do you harmonise and balance the two wants and needs? Because you can't completely go, everything you've ever, you've worked for 50 years, everything you've ever known is completely pointless and worthless now.
Yeah.
But neither can you say, actually, you don't know what you're talking about because you're just new to it. So there's a real juggling, balancing act I'm assuming leaders are having to go through.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And why I think now is a good time to start looking at it for leaders, to start paying attention to what's happening, percolating under the surface. In some organizations, it might be a lot more glaring. But I think it's a challenge. And the reality is, baby boomers are leading. They are the senior leaders, generally, unless it's a startup. They are leading. They make the rules. They are telling us what to do, right? They wield the power, right? There's no getting away from that. That's the reality. Whether or not a younger generation can wield more power remains to be seen. Whether, in the late I think it was the late 90s, we had like the internet boom, right? Where everyone was going into IT and learning all sorts of tech jobs and roles, right? And we had this huge boom, and then I think about 10 years later we had the bust, right? So it's the world of remote working here to stay. Is there going to be a boom and then a bust? How much power does that give a younger cohort, So it's thinking it through is actually, I think, it's about relinquishing some of the power to say, what are your needs? And you touched on that a bit when you said a younger generation will have a certain sets of needs that will be different from an older generation. So what are quick wins that people could have? Look at your benefit system. Does a 25-year-old or 22-year-old need childcare benefit? Do they want it? Do they need parental leave? No. So if all your benefits only favor a certain demographic of people within your organization, and they don't have some of the things which they cherish, like personal development, growth. If you say, no, you're not eligible for that until X number of years in the organization, and you see more organizations are changing that. You have a certain amount that would go towards personal development, because that is something that a younger cohort want. They want to quickly advance. They don't want to wait those 10 years, right? Similarly, if you have someone over 50, flexi working is probably quite important to them. Or a parent, maybe in their 40s as well, or even late 30s, who knows? But it's really engaging with your employees to say, okay, rather than we say, these are all our benefits, could we have flexi benefits for people to choose what they desire? What works for them? What works in their world? Is that something that could happen? Right? What are we willing to let go of? And, I'm being I'm simplifying things a bit. Yeah. to make it clear. Right, because sometimes it can be complex, and sometimes maybe it is just do as I say, right? Which is what we're seeing now with the huge tech company who's just asked their employees to return to work in January, right? What's that really going to do? It remains to be seen. Will people rebel and really go and look for remote work? Or will there be other people too willing to take their place and come into the office?
Yeah.
Everyone's doing the balancing act, not just leaders, and so I think the future of work is one that's going to be interesting.
So we've talked a lot about, I suppose, the younger generation coming through, and I obviously a lot of organisations need to think future proofing their organisation, and as you say, the size of that group is going to be significant in the next few years. But what are some of the challenges, perhaps, from an older workforce? You mentioned at the very beginning some of the things like they're being overlooked for positions, perhaps, or maybe just not as valued as much for what they might bring in certain organisations. If because of stereotypes, you assume they're not so great with technology or whatever. So what are the challenges that leaders need to be looking at?
I think it's the same thing. If you look at, first of all, you don't want to break any laws, right? Firstly, we must point out that there is a law that protects people based on their age. And it's not just the older generation, but they tend to have it the worst in the workplace, right? In terms of stereotypes, they're overlooked. And if some of the stuff we're seeing in the press is true, that even at 40, people are starting to look at you as being past it. That is an issue, because people love to learn, right? And people are capable of learning. And it's a stereotype to say because someone is at a certain age, they're unwilling to learn. There's no one to say that the oldest person in an organization isn't going to be the AI champion in the organization. And then I think, as we kind of started talking about that previously. It's the dual responsibility. There's responsibility for leaders and there's responsibility for employees, as usual anyway. So if I were a 50 plus employee, I'm thinking, like you would in any career change, how do I remain relevant, right? What skills do I need? And in any era, anybody who's unwilling to change gets left behind.
Yeah.
That's the reality of the world of work, right? So that's not going to change. But if an organization does not preclude certain opportunities from their older workforce, then I think everything's right. It will be okay. But if you make up your mind that a certain gym is X how old and no, we won't sign him up. We won't suggest retraining. We won't suggest this workshop, right? And things like that. Not to say that some people do decline. That's fair. That's their choice. But the opportunity should be there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like I said, there is an aging workforce. We can't get away from that. And people don't want to stop working.
No.
People don't want to. And I don't think the solution is to kick them out either.
Well, it's scary. You saying kind of 40 plus is that cutoff for being old in the workplace. I mean, personally, that's offensive because
yes, it is offensive.
but also, then I think like you've potentially still got another 40 years to be working. People are working into their 80s and beyond.
Yeah.
That's a long time to be feel like you're being left on the shelf and not being developed. That must. I'm wondering as we're talking that if organisations are focusing on the younger workforce and I suppose the extremes of the young and the old, we've got this huge expansive middle. Yeah, that is getting ignored in this.
It is true, and I think you're right about that, definitely. And I think when I was thinking about this podcast today, I was thinking, oh gosh, the in-betweeners.
Yeah.
What's happening? Who's doing it? Are people ignoring them? So that cohort is likely to be where your middle managers are. Right. So I think to an extent they are ignored in terms of maybe they do not present that much of an issue to organizations, but then they are the ones expected to facilitate the change that these issues bring up.
Yeah.
Right. So how are we equipping them? How are we preparing them? How are we making them aware of these challenges and maybe having a generational lens on their performance management, on their leadership could help and support them through it. Because I find that there's a lot now that middle managers have to do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's a lot of expectation. And again, those are some of the changes. They talk about the Gen Z generation who expect their managers not just to line manage them, but to mentor them as well. And you could be sitting there thinking, heck, I didn't sign up for that. I just need to get the job done, And there's so much more as well. You have to be a well-being expert as well, a DEI expert as well. And so there's so much that responsibility that comes with management and leadership now. So how are we supporting them? And what might this whole generational piece bring to that as well?
And it's interesting because we are talking in terms of the organisational view and that there will be maybe policies and procedures and stuff that organisations put in place to make sure that they are inclusive in the way that they're dealing with people and that they're trying to provide fair opportunities or whatever. Maybe it's they're be helping to adapt working patterns or even just environmental stuff that needs to happen because people might prefer different ways of working. But you can have all of those things in the world, policies and procedures in place. But if individuals aren't adapting or embracing the potential, then organisationally you're a bit screwed, aren't you? What can organisations, or if you look at it from a board level, what should they be doing? Both in an exercise of self-reflection and how they're leading as a board, but also that individual responsibility that they need to be taking.
I think this might be where culture comes in, right? And leaders actually, if at board level you recognize that this is an issue. So the next question would be to ask, okay, so what sort of culture do we have to foster this sort of environment? What sort of leaders do we have to have in place? What sort of competencies do they have to have? Right? So I'll give you a practical example. When my past is a project management role. And so I hired a team of young people, and they were quite young, probably the youngest team I've worked with, and brought them into an office space with the existing team, who were probably a generation older generally across board. The first thing that was noticeable is how the young people dressed to work. And also what they did whilst they were at work at desk space. So I'll be honest, I had people painting their nails at their desk. I had people with snoozies, shoes off, sitting in a yoga position on chairs. I had people openly booking a trip away the office floor. Now I laugh. I found it very funny, but I just thought, gosh, how times have changed, because this is so unprofessional. Now, I could have led with how unprofessional and brought out the riot act, But what I found is there's a knowledge gap. So that was more of a burden on me to have one-to-one with individuals to talk about how some of the stuff that we're doing were affecting the wider team, right? How they might have not meant for that to happen, but that's what's happening. So whether it was the way they were dressed or, the way they answered the phone or signed off an email, whatever it is, that it took more time to address that with them. So the responsibility is on leadership, but it's on, we mustn't, I think sometimes we can veer a bit to the other side in terms, especially when it comes to the younger generation, thinking they're not willing to learn best practice for whatever setting you're in, right? It's a different conversation whether what we call best practice needs to remain the way it is, right? That's a separate conversation. And if a leader wants to engage their employees in that conversation, all the more the better, right? And we've always done things this way. We've always done things this way, and generations have always done things this way. But could we change that slightly, right? And you can shift a bit. That's a different conversation. But this dual responsibility is real. And I think sometimes the press doesn't help with the stereotypes, giving you the impression that certain generations do not want to learn. Everybody's teachable. Everybody's willing to learn. What leaders need to work on really and focus in is really whether the organization has the values that support a multi-generational workforce. That's the key. Because then it cascades down.
And I suppose we can jump to conclusions that some of these things that we are experiencing in an organisation is due to a multi-generational nature? Because I'm just thinking back to when I was working in corporate and some of the things that you described that you experienced with your younger team members.
Yeah.
I had the flip. I was leading a team where I was the youngest and people were significantly older.
I'm glad you brought that up.
But they had, it wasn't so, I had the same. Some of them would be they'd be doing their personal shopping online. I've had someone sit and paint their nails in an office with me. I've had someone fall asleep in the desk next to me. And so I wonder whether it's not necessarily, and I've had this with people who perhaps they don't see the job as a profession. They see it as a job to make money because they've got, the most important thing for them is outside of work. So sometimes it's not necessarily an age thing. It goes back to the point you've made about values and the values. That why they're showing up and doing what they're doing and how committed they are to delivering the best. And perhaps we shouldn't all jump to assume it's because they're young or because they're old. It could just be it's their attitude, because this job doesn't mean the same to them.
Yeah, you're quite right. I like that example of you being the younger manager, because that's another thing that's happening as well. And how can I ask you how you felt when you were doing that? Leading.
I mean, it was hard because I didn't necessarily have the training or the support. There was an assumption, and I've got a public sector background similar to you, and there was an assumption when you get recruited into management roles that you just know how to do it, and they don't prepare you for the actual stuff that you need to do with people. So that was challenging. I think the work ethic thing I struggled with in some ways, because I was get everything done. I'd work all hours and didn't really understand. But that's more a personality thing, I realise in hindsight, than a maybe a generational thing.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I guess that's the one of the questions I do get asked is, what's really different than like we said at the start, they're always multi-generations in the workplace, right? They are. And a younger generation have always challenged the status quo, right? So that's always happened. I think technology is the difference,
right,
for this younger generation. And what people are seeing on social media, what is being sold as the ideal work life versus the reality. So even though we say that there really isn't any difference in that sense, but the advent of AI, social media, the generation that we call native, what do you call them? Well, technology. Now my foggy brain is taking over.
I've got no idea what they're called. I can't help you.
Technology natives. Let's put it that way. It's like you grew up with the internet. You grew up with social media. That is your norm. You grew up with fast news. You didn't have to wait for anything. Now, it affects sometimes values and assumptions in the workplace. A simple one is, let's take email. Email for a certain generation, 2 to 3 days to respond might not be a bad thing. It's okay. It's professional. You might even put it in your signature that you aim to respond within 48 to 72 hours, depending on your industry, right? Now, for a younger generation, it should be instant. Why haven't you replied to my email? And what's the impact of that with communication in the workplace? And conflict. How does that pan out in reality? So it's going a bit below the surface to say, okay, what is it about this present generation or that generation, older generation in the workplace that might be contributing to maybe conflict, challenges with communication, team building, working in a team. When some teams had to go online during the pandemic, there was different reactions, right? What we have learned since that is that most people liked working from home or adapted. Some people put up a fuss to start with and would never have thought of working from home. I know certain leaders who were totally against their staff working from home before the pandemic. And suddenly the pandemic, you're forced to do that. And that's opened up a different way of working for some organizations. Some are still having challenges with a hybrid and wanting to go back to the. But then, could we imagine another way of being? So I guess it's an intersection.
The communication element is a really interesting one to me. That's my background, so I always find that quite interesting. And it's the simple things around the formality of communication and how that changes through generations. The fact that, I don't mind an emoji in a message to someone. I'll even put it in an email every now and then. But I could imagine that certain people would be really offended if I was to do that. I know working in the health service, there are certain people who are really into hierarchical structures and proper forms of address and all of that, and others that. And I have to say, I was a bit of a rebel in this. I refused to use people, call them doctor or whatever, because I just like, no, we're all equal. But that would be, that was one of the challenges that you face. So I can imagine the conflicts that probably does cause in terms of team building and understanding. Far less that even just abbreviations that people use can be really hard to understand.
And that issue about equality, I think, is really important to this younger generation. And I know we're talking about them a lot, but it's really about what their views and their values, the changes that what it's bringing into the workforce is, I guess, what interests me. And then where I see my role is bridging the generational gap between, okay, they've come in and you're here. How do we get along? How do we communicate? How do we retain them? More importantly, and then that's where the cost is. How do we retain them? Not just about attracting them, but how do we retain them so they are a part of the workforce? So they can learn from the older generation in your organization, as well. But sorry, what was the question that led to this? We were talking about communication.
Oh, I think I was just saying it's an interesting.
The equity. The idea of equity. So you do have some young people in the workplace who feel that because we're all equal, that should give me access to the CEO straight away. Why can't I talk to him or her? Why don't I have access? Why do I have to go through the ranks to speak directly? And some organizations are starting to change that. So you can have a CEO who will say, look, my office is open these hours, book some time with anyone in the organization, 15 minutes of my time, you can have a chat. And those are simple intergenerational practices that don't cost a lot, but shift the mind of people and changes the culture in an organization. So it's just thinking through what the impact of having, maybe now we call it generational gaps, but maybe when things settle a bit, we're just talking about, look, we're talking about how are we onboarding this new generation in the workplace who are going to be dominating it very soon.
Yeah.
And how are we preparing them as well for the world of work? At some point, the older generation are going to stop working and they're going to move up. And are they ready?
Yeah.
How are they prepared? What skills are we making sure they have, particularly if they are moving every 2 to 3 years around? So they are gaining a breadth of skills, but no depth within an organization, which from a career coach point of view, we know sooner or later that's going to be a challenge to move up in an organization.
Yeah. Leaders listening to this conversation and going back into the workplace afterwards, what's their next step? Where do they go if this is now starting to go on their radar and they think, actually, we need to be paying a bit more attention to the impact of this in our organisation?
I think one of the first steps that they can do would be to actually go to HR and find out what data they have on age diversity. Do they actually have an age diverse workforce? Is there a breadth of diversity? We know that productivity goes up, I believe, is it 27% when you have a multi-generational team and intergenerational practices. So what do your teams look like? Are we creating teams that look like ourselves? Are we, and again, as I said, is there another what you call it wrong in intersectionalism when you're talking about DEI, diversity and equity, right? And inclusion. It's another wrong to that, and is often ignored until there's a lawsuit. So it's worth looking at what the data is saying to you. Look at attrition rate at all levels and see whether it's telling you anything. And then perhaps just as we're seeing now with menopause in the workplace, we're seeing lots of workshops, lunch and learn workshops where people are coming in and just talking to leaders in organizations, talking to employees about the impact of that on women in the workplace. Maybe invite an expert to come and talk to your team leaders, your middle managers about the different generations, what that might mean for work, what challenges they might be facing, and then from that see what next.
Fab. So if people want to reach out to you and find out more about the work that you do, or to say thank you for the insights that you've shared on this episode, how can they find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. You can find me. I'm just there as Tomi Ayodeji, the multi-generational workforce coach. And my bio will be also with this podcast when people people want to reach me.
I will put the links in the show notes.
The links will be there for websites, etc.
Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been, there's so much more we could talk about. We could keep going for hours, but I'm sure we've all got things we need to be getting on and doing. So we will leave it there for today. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts and let me know what you thought on LinkedIn. You can find me at Lee Griffith. I'll be back with the next episode in 2 weeks' time. So in the meantime, sign up to my newsletter at sundayskies.com for monthly insights on how else you can lead with impact. Until next time.